A powerful crime boss was on a plane with his screaming baby when a shy mother stepped in and did the impossible. This story shows that true power is meant to protect, not to control. Stay with us to see what she did. In the stale, recycled air of the airplane cabin, Mike Nelson felt completely trapped. He was 30,000 feet in the air, flying between New York and Los Angeles, a king locked in a metal tube. On the ground, his name was a master key, opening any door he wanted and ending any argument before it began. With a simple nod, he could move armies. His money could change the shape of a city. His influence was a hidden river flowing beneath everything. But up here, crammed into a first-class seat, he was nobody. He was helpless. And the reason for his total failure was sleeping unsteadily in his arms. His baby son, Jeffrey, was screaming. It was not the simple cry of a hungry or wet infant. It was a deep, guttural wail that felt like it was being ripped from the child's soul. The shriek pierced the steady hum of the jet engines, a sharp, unending alarm that had been ringing for nearly an hour. Every new wave of sound was a fresh attack on Mike's control. Mike's hands, which had sealed deals and ended lives with absolute calm, now shook as he looked at the carrier he'd set on the empty seat. A thin layer of sweat covered his forehead, feeling cold on his skin. He tried to rock his son, but his actions were clumsy and wrong, more like a nervous twitch than a comforting motion. He whispered gentle words he had heard mothers use in the park, but his voice, built for giving orders, came out as a rough, unconvincing sound. He was failing in front of a captive audience. He could feel their stares, even when they pretended not to look. The businessman seated across the aisle had given him a respectful nod earlier, recognizing him from a magazine. Now, that same man was staring intently out the window, his jaw clenched in frustration. A woman sitting 2 rows up, with her hair in a perfect bun, kept looking back at him. Her face was a clear mix of sympathy and annoyance. Even the flight attendants, who were trained to be calm and collected, were shooting nervous looks at each other from the galley. Their smiles were painted on, bright and stiff, but they could not conceal the worry, or maybe the professional irritation, in their eyes. To them, he was just another struggling father, a common problem. But for Mike, the shame felt like a punch to the gut. He was Mike Nelson. He did not struggle, he won. His anger was a hot knot twisting inside him. In his world, a problem like this, a public disturbance, would be handled quickly and without a trace. An inconvenience would be taken care of. A disruption would be silenced. But he could not order a baby to stop crying. He could not frighten an infant into silence. All the skills that had helped him build an empire, all the fear and power he had gathered over 2 decades, were completely useless against the desperate, unfiltered misery of his own son. The baby's cries became louder, more frantic. With each piercing scream, another piece of Mike's powerful image fell away, revealing the raw, unfamiliar weakness underneath. The constant noise was more than just an irritation. It felt like an accusation. It was pulling him back into the shadows of his own history, to the very beginning of this unwanted fatherhood. The baby's cry was unlocking a door in his mind he always kept bolted shut. A door that led to his own father, Elijah. Elijah Nelson had constructed Mike's entire existence for him, one calculated move at a time. On the surface, his father was a charming patriarch with warm smiles and firm handshakes, a man who projected grandfatherly kindness. He built an image as a good-hearted leader, both in his legal businesses and in the underground organization that was the real source of their family's strength. But Mike had always seen the cold, endless gears of a machine working behind his father's eyes. Elijah was constantly calculating odds, moving people around like chess pieces on a board only he could see. From his earliest memories, Mike was not treated like a son. He was trained as an heir. His childhood was not about playing games in the yard, but about learning the rules of power. He recalled an afternoon when he was maybe 10 years old, sitting in the big leather chair in his father's office, a room that always smelled like old books and ambition. A man named Arthur, A longtime associate stood at the desk, begging for forgiveness over a lost shipment. The man was sweating, and his voice was shaking. Mike had always liked Arthur. He sometimes gave him little animals carved from wood. Elijah listened with a look of profound understanding. When Arthur finished speaking, Elijah offered his warm, reassuring smile. "Arthur, you have been a part of this for 20 years, he said, his voice soft. "You are family." Arthur was so relieved he almost cried. Elijah got up, came around his desk, and put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "And that is why this is so hard. But a single weak link, no matter how dear to us, threatens the entire chain. You see that, don't you?" The warmth in his tone never changed, but the words landed with the finality of a closing door. Arthur understood. He left that office a defeated man, and Mike never saw him, or his wooden animals, ever again. Once he was gone, Elijah looked at Mike. His smile was gone, replaced by the cool, measuring gaze of a professor. "Feelings are a weakness, Michael. Loyalty is a tool. When loyalty stops being useful, you get rid of it. Do you understand?" Mike simply nodded, the lesson landing like a block of ice in his stomach. This was his schooling. He was taught about strength, not affection. He heard stories of betrayal, not fairy tales at bedtime. Elijah's one great obsession was the family name, the continuation of their bloodline, the survival of the empire he had built from his own father's smaller, more brutal operation. This obsession turned into a terrible fear as Mike became a young man with no apparent interest in women or relationships. He was quiet, a loner, and emotionally closed off. He was brilliant at the business tasks his father gave him, with a sharp, cold mind that made Elijah proud. But his private life was a mystery. Elijah did not see a complicated young man dealing with the coldness of his own life. He saw a danger to his legacy. His paranoia grew, creating two terrifying scenarios in his mind. Either his son could not have children, a dead end for the family line, or he was, as Elijah would say in moments of anger, interested in men. Either possibility meant the end of the Nelson dynasty. The idea consumed him. He started observing Mike with an intense focus, his friendly mask barely hiding his growing alarm. He decided that if his son would not secure the family's future himself, he would do it for him. The baby's scream cut through the air again, yanking Mike from the memory of that office and throwing him into a newer, more toxic one. The memory of that night was a blur of confusion and humiliation. His father had demanded a dinner to celebrate a major business deal, just the two of them. He made a toast. "To my son," Elijah had said, his eyes shining in the dim light of the fancy restaurant, for making his father proud. It was a rare display of paternal pride, and that alone should have been a red flag. Mike remembered the drink, an expensive, aged liquor that tasted slightly wrong, somehow thick and sweet on his tongue. He had not thought much about it then. After that, the world started to blur, his mind turning to mud. His memory of what happened next is a fractured, nauseating fog. He had a faint, broken image of his father leading him out of the restaurant, a firm grip on his arm. He remembered the silent glide of an elevator, the distant sounds of a hotel hallway, the quiet click of a room key. He remembered his father's voice, low and calm, telling him to rest for a bit, and then his father left. A woman came into the room. She had a rehearsed smile and hollow eyes. Mike remembered a deep sense of being violated, like he was a spectator in his own life, his body heavy and disconnected. He was aware of her, of what she was doing, but he felt like he was watching it all from a great, hazy distance. The next morning, he woke up alone in the strange hotel room. His head pounded with a dull, chemical pain. A cold, heavy certainty settled deep inside him. Something had been taken from him. Months went by. The event was a poisoned memory he tried to push down. It was just another example of his father's suffocating grip on his life. He buried himself in his work. The clean logic of money and power was a good way to numb the pain. Then, a woman named Elena showed up at one of his private offices. He knew who she was immediately. She was the woman from the hotel. With a strange sense of detachment, she stood in front of his desk. She told him she was pregnant, and the true horror of his father's plan crashed down on him. Elijah had not merely wanted a successor, he had engineered one. He had drugged his son and arranged a conception just to feed his own obsession. A cold, empty sickness filled Mike, followed by a blinding, helpless rage. He had never been close to a woman, never experienced kindness or real connection. His existence was a cold world of transactions and force. And now a stranger carried his child, a life created from the ultimate betrayal. He was completely trapped. Elijah had already won. The scheme was unfolding. And Mike, with all his influence in the world, was powerless to stop his own father. Elena, however, showed a strength of her own. In their final tense meeting with lawyers, she stated she would not end the pregnancy. She was determined to have the baby, for reasons Mike did not care to know. Maybe the child was her one chance at a better life. Maybe she felt a genuine maternal bond. It made no difference to him. He never laid eyes on her again after that meeting. The whole situation was managed by others, just one more deal in a life made of them. Then, 9 months later, a cold, typed letter arrived. It said Elena had died from complications during childbirth. It also declared with stark finality that he was now the only legal guardian of a healthy baby boy named Jeffrey. Now that same Jeffrey was screaming in his arms. He was a living reminder of his father's manipulation and his own emotional void. This child was the product of cold calculation and duty, not love or desire. Mike stared down at the red, wrinkled face, the mouth forming a perfect circle of despair, and felt nothing. There was no love, no connection. There was only a huge empty space and the crushing burden of a duty he had never accepted. His life had taught him to categorize people as useful or useless, as partners or rivals. He had no idea how to see his own son as anything but a problem he could not fix. The tight knot of anger and helplessness in his chest was becoming unbearable. He felt a terrible, frightening urge to shake the baby, just to silence the noise. At that moment he saw movement. A woman across the aisle was getting up. She looked ordinary, dressed in simple clothes made for comfort, not style. Her hair was pulled back from her face. She had a certain stillness, a calm purpose in her stance that was the exact opposite of Mike's own tense energy. She did not wait for permission. She did not ask if she could help. She just met his frantic, desperate eyes for a brief moment. He saw no pity in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. Then she started walking. She crossed the small aisle with confident, steady steps, even as the plane shook slightly. She reached over him, her hands moving with a natural skill. Mike flinched out of habit. He was not used to anyone entering his personal space without an invitation, not used to the touch of strangers. But her attention was entirely on the screaming child. Her hands were soft but firm as they slid under Jeffrey's back and head, lifting him from Mike's stiff, awkward hold. The instant Jeffrey's body rested on her shoulder, the crying stopped. It did not just quiet down, it ended completely. The sudden, deep silence was more jarring than the screaming had been. Mike's ears were ringing. He sat frozen, watching the woman rock Jeffrey with a slow, steady motion that seemed purely instinctive. She hummed a low, simple melody, her cheek resting gently on top of the baby's head. Jeffrey had been a rigid, screaming ball of agony. He now melted into her arms, his small body becoming soft and relaxed. A little fist that had been clenched tight with distress opened up and rested on her shoulder. Mike's mind was usually a fortress of cold planning and reason. Now it was a whirlwind of chaos. How did she do that? Why did it work? He had tried everything. He had access to more resources than some countries. But this normal woman did in 3 seconds what he could not do in an hour. She had not used threats or power. She had used a language he did not understand, a strength he did not have. She had used tenderness. He watched a stranger comfort his son. He watched as Jeffrey's panicked breathing slowed and became even. His eyelids fluttered, then closed in an expression of pure peace. The woman looked at him, her eyes free of judgment. They held a calm knowledge that unsettled him more than any threat could. In that moment, he was not the powerful Mike Nelson. He was just a man who had been confronted with a deep personal failing, a coldness so complete he could not even soothe his own child. She had entered his world, a world built on control and fear, and had defeated him with a simple act of compassion. For the first time in his adult life, a crack appeared in his defenses, not from an attack, but from a gentle touch. As the plane started its slow descent toward the lights of Los Angeles, Mike Nelson sat in silence. He watched a stranger hold his sleeping son and wondered if he had built his entire life on the wrong kind of strength. A short, quiet exchange took place after Jeffrey had fallen asleep on her. She had passed the sleeping baby back to Mike with that same calm skill, and the child did not wake. Mike felt a strange need to acknowledge what she had done and offered a stiff, formal thank you. His voice felt unnatural in his own throat. She just smiled, a small, real smile that made the corners of her eyes wrinkle. He just needed a different view, she said, brushing off his thanks. Her name, she told him, was Mary. In the soft, quiet talk that followed, over the hum of the engines, she mentioned she owned a little coffee shop. She was flying back after visiting her family in the East. That small, ordinary detail stuck in his mind. When the plane finally reached the gate and the seatbelt light turned off, the cabin filled with the normal sounds of arrival. Passengers talked, overhead compartments opened, and people began to move into the aisle. The noise seemed far away and unclear to Mike. He collected his things like a machine, his thoughts still focused inward. The quiet confidence in Mary's presence had calmed his shattered nerves. She had not passed judgment on him. She had just helped. And in helping, she had given him a moment of calm, something more valuable than gold in his world. He found himself hoping with a new and powerful feeling that this sense of peace was not just a temporary fluke. There was something about her that he could not just ignore. By the time he had made his way through the terminal, passed through customs, and collected his bags, the thought of Mary was a constant hum in the back of his mind. It was not only what she did for Jeffrey, although that was a miracle that felt almost unreal. It was the total lack of fear she had shown. She had walked right into his private crisis, a situation most people would run from, and had created an instant calm. He was left shaken by it, a king overthrown by a simple act of kindness. He looked at his phone. A private car was waiting to take him to a cold hotel suite before his first meeting with his West Coast team. He had a couple of hours. He could use that time to pull himself together, to force his brain back into the cold, calculated mindset he needed. His fingers paused over the screen, ready to confirm his plan, but his thumb moved on its own. He opened a browser and searched for the name of the cafe she had mentioned. It was a small, simple place, located in a quiet neighborhood far from the tall, shining buildings of the financial district. It was the complete opposite of his entire world. The thought of walking into a place like that felt like breaking a rule, like crossing into a different country without a passport. It was not logical. It was not efficient. It had no strategic value. But the desire to go there was overwhelming. It was a pull toward the only thing that had felt real in a day of complete chaos. Without letting himself reconsider the choice, Mike found the address, canceled the car with a short text to his driver, and waved down a taxi, holding the infant carrier firmly in his other hand. When the taxi stopped at the curb, Mike saw the cafe was nothing like the sleek, powerful places he usually went to. It was not fancy or new. It was simple, with a painted sign that said, "The Daily Grind." Its large windows glowed with a warm, welcoming light. The smell of roasting coffee beans and fresh pastries, of cinnamon and sugar, floated out when he opened the door. It was a rich and comforting scent that was completely foreign to him. He looked around the room, and his heart gave a sudden hard beat against his ribs. There she was. Mary was working behind the counter. She handed a cup to a customer and shared a smile that was both soft and real. Her hair, which had been tied back on the plane, now fell in gentle waves on her shoulders. She wore a simple dark apron over a plain shirt. Her entire presence seemed to create the calm feeling that filled the small shop. Mike paused at the entrance, a man of immense power who suddenly felt like an unwelcome guest. He was completely out of his element. The crushing weight of his life, the constant threat of danger, and the tangled web of secrets all seemed to vanish at the door of this quiet place. As he stood there, a strange and unfamiliar ache tugged at his heart. The bell chimed softly as he shut the door behind him. Mary looked up, and their eyes met from across the room. She showed no surprise, no sudden confusion. She just held his gaze for a moment, and her smile returned, even warmer this time, like she was greeting an old friend. "Mike," she said, her voice as calm and steady as it was on the plane. "Something told me I would see you again." A flash of shock went through him. He had come here on a wild, illogical whim, but she seemed completely untroubled by it. His mind, always looking for angles and reasons, searched for a motive, but came up empty. "I did not think I would find you," he confessed, his voice sounding harsh and alien in the peaceful cafe. He felt like an actor on the wrong set, delivering lines from a completely different story. Mary's smile softened even more. "You are not the only one who has surprises," she answered, her voice easy and relaxed. "I did not really believe you would show up, but I am happy you did." A short silence fell between them, filled with questions that went unasked. He took one step forward, then another, until he stood at the counter. She motioned for him, and they moved to a small private table in the corner. Jeffrey was still fast asleep in his carrier, which Mike set down carefully on the chair next to him. Mary did not ask about his work, his money, or his life in New York. She did not try to find out who he was or what he did. She just sat there with him, and her presence was a comfort. He had no idea how much he had been starving for it. They started to talk over cups of coffee that she made herself. Mike began hesitantly, sharing small, broken fragments of his life. He talked about his son, about the immense and overwhelming challenge of being a single father, and about the endless pressure that shaped his world. He did not say what he did for a living, but he described its coldness, its loneliness. He was not used to being this vulnerable, to letting any part of his armor show cracks. But there was something in Mary's patient, quiet gaze that made him feel safe. For the first time in years, Mike felt like someone was truly listening. In return, Mary told him about her own life. She talked about raising her daughter by herself after a painful past, and about the emotional wounds she still had but would not let define her. A quiet power flowed through her words, a deep strength that Mike found himself admiring. Even after everything she had been through, she still had the ability to be kind. She still showed compassion in a world that rarely gave any. That, Mike understood, was a truly rare and valuable kind of strength. "I am not sure why I came here," Mike admitted during a quiet moment in their talk, and the words cost him more than he showed. "But I am happy that I did. I am not used to this feeling." Mary's gentle smile appeared again. "It is all right," she said, her voice soft. "We are all just trying to figure things out. I do not want anything from you, Mike. But if you ever just need to talk to someone, I will be here." As they spoke, the feeling grew inside him that this was not just a random meeting. Mary felt like an anchor in the chaotic storm of his life. She knew nothing about the darkness he operated in, the violence he could command, or the empire of fear he controlled. Strangely, her not knowing was his protection when he was with her. He was not a mafia boss. He was simply a man, flawed and trying his best. She was not scared of him. That simple truth was both deeply unnerving and incredibly freeing. Their conversation continued for a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mike felt a sense of peace, a quieting of the constant alertness that was his normal way of life. But as the afternoon sun started to set, the heavy reality of his other life began to press down on him. The world of secrets, loyalty, and violence was waiting for him. It was the world that had shaped him, the world that he belonged to. Mary's voice cut through his dark thoughts. "I am happy you stopped by today," she said. "Sometimes life puts us in the places we are supposed to be." Mike looked at her, his mind a whirlwind of different feelings. He could not ignore the strong connection he felt, a pull towards her that made no logical sense. She was not like anyone he knew. She saw him, not his reputation or his power, but the person underneath all of it. He nodded slowly, unable to find any words. The decision ahead of him was becoming clearer, but it was not going to be simple. The life he had constructed was demanding all he had. But in this quiet coffee shop, Mike saw a faint possibility of another path, a chance to be more than the man his father made him. When it was time to go, he rose, and the return to his own reality felt like a physical shock. Before he could leave, Mary gazed up at him with an expression of pure, simple honesty. "Be careful, Mike," she said gently. "You and your son. You know my location if you ever need anything." He gave a sharp, final nod, but something new was awake inside him. It was the will to be a better person, to become more than he was. As he left the warmth of the cafe for the cool night air, the choice before him felt heavier than ever. But for the very first time, Mike felt like he might actually have one. The days after his first visit to the coffee shop were a lesson in contrast. Mike navigated the lavish prisons of his Los Angeles enterprises, his public expression as cold and controlled as always. But his mind was a storm. He led a meeting from a glass office that looked out over the city, while his top men gave updates on shipping routes and rival pressures. Yet his thoughts returned to the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet resolve in Mary's eyes. His world of figures and violence, once his only truth, now felt weak and transparent, like a flickering projection. The only thing that felt real was the memory of a child sleeping and a woman's simple, brave smile. He felt the weight of his obligations more strongly than he had in years. But it now felt like a thick chain pulling him back to a life he was starting to doubt. With every hour that went by, the calm he found in Mary's little cafe felt more like a far-off fantasy, a short, impossible refuge in the wasteland of his life. Her kindness had broken through the layers of protection he had spent his whole life building, and now he felt exposed. He never knew he needed that kind of warmth, but now that he had felt it, he missed it with a real ache deep in his chest. The hotel suite he was staying in was a huge, cold space built to impress powerful visitors and wealthy gamblers. It had every possible luxury, from a bar full of expensive drinks to a stunning view of the city lights. But it was not made for a baby. The sharp edges of the modern furniture, the fragile statues on low tables, and the countless electrical outlets at a crawling baby's level all created a new and confusing list of problems that money and power could not solve. He had sent two of his most trusted men, a pair of huge men known only as Leo and Sal, to run an errand. These were men who could protect a building from a major attack. They once very efficiently convinced a difficult witness to move to a country that did not send people back. Their talents were famous in some circles, but their current job was turning out to be their hardest one yet, baby-proofing the hotel suite. They stood in the center of the giant living room, surrounded by shopping bags from a toy store, looking completely and totally helpless. Sal, a man as big as a mountain with a scarred face and hands like dinner plates, held a small plastic bag of outlet covers like it was a live bomb with the pin pulled. "Boss," Sal said, his deep voice thick with real confusion. "You want us to put these in the outlets? All of them? What, you think someone is going to hide a microphone in one? Because if they do, that can be fixed. I know a guy who does a thorough sweep, much better than some plastic junk. Mike shook his head. No, Sal. He rubbed the bridge of his nose between his thumb and forefinger. In his other arm, Jeffrey made a series of happy gurgling sounds. The baby had no idea about the strategic dilemma he was causing. They are for him, Mike explained, so he cannot put his fingers in the socket when he starts to move around. Sal stared at the baby, then at the wall outlet, and then back to Mike. His brow was creased in concentration, like he was solving a difficult math problem. He will crawl directly to the outlets? Is that what you mean? Babies go everywhere, Sal. They are like magnets for danger. It is a fundamental rule of being a parent. Leo, the leaner and quicker of the two, had walked over to the large coffee table made of glass. He studied its sharp edge with the careful gaze of a demolitions man. He was judging the building for its weak points. He rapped the corner with his knuckle and listened. I can grind this down, Leo said with a serious tone. I have a diamond file in the car. It will take me about an hour. Or we could remove the table completely. From a strategic point of view, it is a risk anyway. It offers bad cover during a gunfight, and the glass would explode into a million shards. Very dangerous. You will not file the table, Leo, Mike said. His patience was running out, but a new and weird sense of amusement was growing inside him. And we are not expecting a gunfight here in the hotel room. There are supposed to be soft corners you can get. Pads? You attach them to the edges. Pads? Leo repeated. He turned to face him with a confused look. Like for soundproofing? To soften the noise of an impact? No, like for babies, Mike clarified. Soft pads made of rubber. So when they run straight into a table, which they will, they do not split their heads open on the corner. Leo processed this new information with the same intense focus he would give a mission plan. He gave a slow nod. Protective equipment for the asset. That makes sense. We will get the pads. Sal, in the meantime, had started examining the cord on a floor lamp. He lifted it, following its line to the wall. What about this, boss? This is a choking hazard, an electrical hazard, and a tripping hazard. This lamp is a triple danger. Mike glanced at the lamp, then at Sal, then toward the ceiling. He wondered again what his father would say if he saw this. The next in line for the Nelson Empire, discussing the dangers of a lamp with two men who had broken more bones than a hospital surgeon. Just bundle the cord, make it secure, figure it out. He made them go back to the store with another list, one that was more precise. He wrote it himself because he could not rely on their understanding of spoken directions. The list had things like foam corner guards, locks for cabinets, and baby gates. The phone call he got 20 minutes later proved they were still completely lost. Boss, it is Leo. His voice was a low whisper, the kind he used on surveillance jobs. We are in the baby section. There are a lot of soft colors here, mostly pink and yellow. These colors have very little tactical benefit. They provide zero camouflage. Mike shut his eyes and rested his head against the suite's cool window. The color is not important, Leo. Just buy the things on the list. Right. Right. Okay, so about this baby food. They have gentle, NeuroPro, sensitive, and one called soy-based. Which one should we get? Is one of them reinforced with vitamins or something? Is there a tactical benefit to one of these over the others? Just buy the one in the yellow container, Leo, the one with the word infant on the label. There was a brief silence and a rustling noise. Then Leo's voice came back, a little louder. Sal is asking about the diapers. They have sizes like boots. What size is the asset? I mean the baby. Mike looked at Jeffrey, who was now busy chewing on his own hand. How am I supposed to know, Leo? Just make a guess. He is not very big. Get the small size. Small. Okay. Another moment passed. There is newborn. Size 1, size 2, all the way to size 6. Newborn seems really small. Is he a newborn? He looks like he has been around for a while. He is a couple of months old. Just buy size 1 and size 2. We will make it work. Understood. Getting size 1 and size 2. Also, Sal discovered something called a diaper genie. He wants to know if it is a storage unit or if it can grant wishes. Mike ended the call. He looked down at his son. His son gazed back, a line of drool on his chin, completely unaware of the operational chaos he created. In spite of it all, Mike felt the corner of his mouth lift into a smile. This was his life now. He was split between a world of violent order and a world of confusing, soft-colored disorder. It was draining. It was ridiculous. But something about it felt more honest than anything he had known for years. The call from his father arrived late that evening. Mike had finally gotten Jeffrey to sleep after a long hour of difficult attempts. He learned the hard way that the formula needed to be exactly the right temperature when the baby spit it all over his face. The swaddle, a method Mary had shown him once, took 7 tries to master. When the baby's eyes finally shut and his breathing became steady, Mike felt a pride that was greater than any successful business deal. The quiet in the hotel room was a rare and valuable thing. The sharp ring of his phone destroyed it. He moved fast to answer it before it woke the baby, his heart pounding with that old, familiar anger. He knew who was calling before he even saw the name. "You have been silent," Elijah said. His voice was smooth and agreeable, the kind he used when he was circling a topic like a predator sensing weakness. He did not bother with greetings. He never did. "I have been occupied, Father," Mike answered. His voice was flat as he walked to the other side of the room, away from the baby. "Occupied is good. Occupied means profit," Elijah continued. "The D'Angelo problem on the West Coast needs your handling. He has grown confident. He believes we are distracted, especially with your new duties. You must go and teach him again about the high price of that confidence." The D'Angelo family was a constant irritation. They were a smaller group that would test the edges of the Nelson territory from time to time. It was a standard problem, something a local enforcer would typically solve with a clear, brutal warning. For his father to bring it to him, and to specifically mention Jeffrey, was an obvious test. He was asking Mike if he still had the resolve for this kind of work. "I will take care of it," Mike stated, his voice empty of emotion. "I am sure you will," Elijah replied, and his voice became hard as iron. "I also hear that you have been making other stops. A little coffee place in a quiet part of town. An unusual spot for a man with your expensive tastes." The casual way his father revealed this was a direct threat. "I see everything. You have no secrets from me." Mike felt a cold fear tighten in his gut. His father controlling his professional life was one thing, but for him to intrude on this new, delicate part of his life with Mary was something else entirely. "I was getting coffee," Mike said, his voice flat and hard. Elijah let out a dry, cold laugh that grated in Mike's ear like stone. "Of course you were. Just do not forget what matters, Michael. One moment of weakness can undo a lifetime of effort. Our effort, our family's name. Do not let some woman with a tragic past in a little shop make you weak. You are a Nelson. Never forget what that stands for." The call was over, but the menace remained in the room like a bad smell. Mike stood in the dark suite, with city lights creating long shadows on the floor. He felt the old prison closing around him again. Elijah would never accept someone like Mary. She was not the right type. She was too kind, too real, too decent. Her worth could not be counted in money or power, so in Elijah's world, she was worthless. The anger and rebellion that surged inside Mike were powerful, a wave of warmth pushing back against the icy grip of his father's authority. The feeling did not drive him away from Mary. It pulled him closer. He found a space in his schedule the following afternoon. It was a 4-hour gap between a meeting on logistics and a dinner to secure a new route for distribution. He knew it was reckless, a serious risk. But the peace he found in her cafe was a memory that called to him. He hired a trusted nanny to look after Jeffrey, a woman who had been screened more intensely than most government agents. Then he returned. The bell on the door sounded different this time. It felt like a welcome. Mary sat at a small table by the window, focused on paperwork. A pair of reading glasses rested on her nose. The sight was simple, domestic, and he found it deeply charming. She glanced up, and a genuine open smile instantly lit up her face. It hit him with a surprising force that stole his breath for a moment. "You returned," she said, her tone making it sound like the most ordinary thing. "I said I might," he answered. For the first time in days, he felt the tightness in his shoulders start to loosen. He approached her table, and she motioned to the empty chair. He ended up staying for more than an hour. Their conversation started with simple topics, like the weather and a book she was reading. They talked about the strange habits of her usual patrons. She described Mr. Abernathy, an older gentleman who arrived at 7 o'clock every morning. He always ordered black coffee and worked on a crossword puzzle for an hour, using a pen. "He never uses a pencil," Mary remarked, shaking her head with a look of awe. "The confidence on that man. He just commits. If he makes an error, he draws a line through it and continues. I think it is inspiring." Mike heard himself laugh. It was a real, unexpected sound. He could not recall the last time something so simple had made him laugh. In his line of work, commitment meant life or death. To hear about a man applying that same principle to a crossword was incredibly refreshing. He took Jeffrey with him 2 days later. The baby was not sleeping this time. He was fussy and wide awake, his little face wrinkled in protest against the world. Mike felt that familiar sense of helplessness rising inside him. But Mary simply smiled and held out her arms for the child. "May I?" she asked. He handed Jeffrey over with immense relief. The baby's crying stopped almost the moment she held him. She spoke to him in soft, sweet sounds, the kind of noises Mike would never have considered making. Jeffrey's large, curious eyes stared up at her face. But the quiet did not last long. A very distinct smell started to come from the baby. Mike knew it immediately. It was the scent that had become his greatest challenge. Mary wrinkled her nose, then she laughed. "I believe someone needs to be changed," she said, giving the baby back. "The restroom in the back has a changing table." Mike carried his son toward the back room. He felt like a soldier marching into a firefight. The restroom was tiny but spotless. He unfolded the changing pad, placed Jeffrey on top, and started the task. He had performed this duty a dozen times, yet it never became easier. The baby would not stay still. The dirty diaper was a disaster zone. The clean diaper seemed impossible to line up correctly. He finally came out after a battle that seemed to take forever. He was exhausted and looked a mess, but he had won. He dropped into the chair opposite Mary. "I do not get it," he said, his hand running through his hair. "I follow the directions perfectly. There are tabs. The box has pictures. It is supposed to be a simple, clear process." Mary looked at him, her lips trembling as she tried hard not to smile. She could not hold it in. A pure, bright laugh escaped her, a beautiful sound that echoed in the small shop. It was not a mean laugh. It was filled with warmth and kindness. "It is not a process, Mike," she said. Her eyes were still bright with humor. "It is an art. And sometimes it is a wrestling match. You will figure it out. I am sure of it." He realized he did not feel bad about making her laugh. No one had ever laughed at him in this way before, not with such pure, simple warmth. In his life, laughter was often used as a tool to put someone down or make them feel small. Her laughter was an invitation to see how ridiculous things could be, to just be human with her. She demonstrated how to position the bottle at the proper angle. Her hand brushed against his for a second as she corrected his hold. That brief contact sent a surprising warmth through him. It was a feeling that had nothing to do with dominance or intimidation. In that little cafe, with the smell of coffee and the quiet hum of other customers, he was not a crime boss. He was just a man trying to be a father, getting lessons from a woman who made it all look so natural. In that moment of shared, simple humanity, He knew he had to take a chance. A real one. "I am in the city for a little while," he said. He kept his voice steady and casual as he held the now quiet baby. "Business. It is a complicated situation." Mary simply nodded. Her expression was patient, letting him take his time. "I was just wondering," he started. The words felt strange and clumsy coming from him. This question felt bigger than any high-stakes deal he had ever managed. "If you would be free to have dinner sometime, without the cafe, without the baby, just us." Her smile grew wider, lighting up her eyes with a spark that made his heart skip a beat. "I would like that very much, Mike." The dinner felt like stepping into a whole new world for him. He spent a ridiculous amount of time planning it, using the same careful approach he would for a high-risk job. He picked a quiet restaurant, a neutral spot that no family owned or influenced, a fact that his men took hours to verify. He stood in front of his hotel closet for a full 10 minutes, a rare moment of indecision, before choosing a simple dark jacket and pants. He tried on 3 different ties before deciding to go without one. He felt a foolish, teenage nervousness while he waited for her at their table. His palms were a little sweaty. He kept fiddling with the cutlery. This was a new feeling for him. His life had never allowed for this kind of emotion. In his world, waiting usually led to violence, not a nice dinner. When she entered the restaurant, he stood up. She wore a simple dark blue dress that had a faint shimmer in the soft light. It was elegant because it was so simple. Her hair was down, framing her shoulders in gentle waves. She was beautiful. Watching her walk toward him across the quiet dining room felt like a scene from a life he had only witnessed in films. Their talk that evening was different. It went deeper, became more personal, like slowly uncovering layers. She talked about her daughter, who was now in college studying art history. She spoke of the mix of pride and absolute fear she felt sending her out into the world alone. "She calls me 2 times a week," Mary said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes it is just to tell me what she ate for lunch. I wait for those calls. I act like I am not just sitting by the phone, but I am. Every single time." She talked about her own younger years, about a tough marriage to a man who was charming to everyone else but was cruel and controlling behind closed doors. Her voice became softer as she spoke, but it never lost its strength. "He wanted to control my thoughts," she said, slowly turning the wine in her glass, her eyes looking far away for a second. "He thought of me as a part of himself, something he could perfect and show off. If I had my own opinions, my own ambitions, he took it as a personal attack against him. It took me a very long time to see that his prison was built from words and demands, but it was a prison nonetheless." She looked up at him then, her eyes direct and clear. "I left him with just one suitcase and my 2-year-old daughter. It was the scariest and most freeing day of my life. He showed me exactly what I never wanted. I learned that true power is not about controlling someone else. It is about controlling your own life and choosing your own direction." Her words struck him with a sharp, almost painful clarity. He could see the connection to his own life, to his father's suffocating control, and his obsession with making Mike a perfect copy of his own cold ambition. He found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. The words just came out, almost without him trying. "He decided what I was going to be before I was even born," Mike said. His voice was quiet, the words tasting like a secret he had kept for too long. "Every decision, every move was planned out for me. I was not raised. I was constructed, like one of his buildings, cold, practical, and built for his needs. My childhood had no games or laughter. It was all lessons. Lessons on power, on how to use people, and on the price of showing any weakness." "And is that who you are?" Mary asked gently. "The man that he constructed?" He looked at her, at the true kindness in her eyes, a kindness that did not ask for anything. For the first time, he thought about the question with complete, raw honesty. "I do not know," he admitted. Saying it out loud was a huge act of vulnerability. It left him feeling completely exposed, and at the same time, strangely relieved. Until just recently, I never even thought to ask. I just existed. I was always what they made me. But now, I am not so sure that is who I am. Or maybe, it is not who I want to be anymore. When dinner was over, they walked outside into the cool evening. He led her to her car. The street was peaceful, with the city's sounds just a low hum in the distance. He stopped under the gentle light of a street lamp. Every one of his trained survival skills told him to keep his distance, to keep the barrier between his two lives solid and strong. The danger was enormous. He knew his father was watching. But the desire to be near her, to have this normal and real connection, was more powerful than any fear. He moved closer and kissed her. It was not a kiss of raw passion, like the empty ones from his past. It was gentle and uncertain, like exploring a new land. It was a single moment of unprotected truth, a silent conversation in one gesture. When he moved away, he saw surprise in her expression. And then a powerful, true warmth came into her eyes. That look from her made him feel like he existed. For the very first time, someone truly saw him. The hope that bloomed inside was so strong it made his head spin. He went back to his hotel room that night feeling weightless, like the world was suddenly painted in brighter colors. He looked in on Jeffrey, sleeping soundly in his crib. Mike stood there for a long time, watching the tiny rise and fall of his son's chest. He looked at the child and saw a person, not a problem. He saw life, not just a duty. The next day, that feeling was completely destroyed. One of his own black cars had been following him for days. He knew about it, he always knew, but he had decided it did not matter. Now he understood its terrible purpose. A courier with dead, empty eyes delivered a package to his room. There was no sender, no message, only a thick, plain envelope. His hands were perfectly steady as he opened it. A single, sharp photograph was inside. It showed him and Mary under the glow of a street lamp, frozen in that quiet, private moment. The picture was flawless. It captured the look on both of their faces with perfect clarity. His eyes were shut. Her hand rested on his chest. It was taken from far away, from a rooftop somewhere, using a powerful lens. The message was just as direct as the one Elijah had spoken, but this one was colder. It said, "I am always watching. You have nowhere to run. She belongs to my world now." A pure, white-hot fury erupted inside him, burning away everything else. This was a violation unlike any he had ever known. It was a stain on the only pure thing he had. He grabbed a heavy lamp from a table and hurled it against the wall, where it exploded into 1,000 glittering pieces. The crash was loud and sharp, but it did nothing to silence the rage inside of him. His first thought was to call his father. He wanted to scream all the angry words he had held back for his entire life. But he understood it was a useless idea. Elijah would pretend he knew nothing, or worse, he would call it a necessary step to protect the family. His father was an expert at turning Mike's anger back on him, making him feel like a spoiled child. His second thought was to protect Mary by leaving her. He would cut her off and simply vanish from her life. It was the smart, strategic choice. If she was a weakness, he needed to remove that weakness. This was the cold logic he had been trained in since birth. It was exactly what his father expected of him. But the idea of a life without her, of going back to that cold, lonely world, was now impossible to bear. He had experienced something real, and he could not just erase the memory of it. He carried the photograph in his pocket, where it felt like it was burning through the fabric. He walked to the cafe that afternoon. He had to see her, to look at her, and decide if she was worth the risk. Not his risk, but hers. He saw her behind the counter, arranging pastries and humming a quiet song. When she noticed him, she smiled, but the smile died when she saw his face. "Mike, what is wrong?" she asked, her voice full of worry, as she walked toward him. He could not find the words to tell her about the picture, or about his father's suffocating control. How could he make her understand his world? How could he say that a simple dinner and a kiss had made her a target in a game she did not even know was being played? The explanation would sound crazy. It would turn the clean, simple connection between them into something ugly. "I need to go to New York for a bit," he said. The lie tasted like acid in his mouth. "Something came up at work. It is an emergency." He saw disappointment in her eyes, a quick shadow that she tried to hide. She was a strong woman. He knew that about her. "Oh, okay. How long will you be gone?" "I do not know," he said, his voice tight. He wanted to touch her, but he felt like his hands were contaminated by his life. "Mary," he started, "this is difficult. It is more difficult than you can imagine." She looked at him, her eyes calm, trying to find the truth he was hiding. "I understand," she said, but she could not possibly understand how deep it went. "You do not have to say anything. Just be safe, you and him." He left the cafe feeling like a coward. He was not running toward an answer. He was running away from the only person who made him want to be a good man. The choice was ripping him apart. On one side was his family, his inheritance, and the violent world he came from. On the other side was a gentle woman, a sleeping baby, and the hope for a life he never thought he could have. He had to choose. He could not have both. The photograph was proof that his father would make sure of that. He could cut Mary out of his life and become the cold, ruthless leader his father wanted. Or he could find a way to cut himself out of the family business. That second option felt like a dream. You did not just leave the Nelson family. They did not offer a pension plan. The only way to get out was in a coffin. But later that night, sitting in his room with broken glass all over the floor, he looked at the picture again. He saw the warmth in Mary's face, a hope he had put there. Then he saw his own face, and he did not recognize the man. He looked calm, open, and at peace. He understood that going back to his old life, a life without that feeling, would be like dying anyway. This was no longer just a fight against his father. It was a war against the person he had always been, and he did not know who he wanted to win. The next morning, he flew to New York with the lie to Mary sitting like a stone in his stomach. Jeffrey slept quietly in his carrier, unaware of the war inside his father. This time, Mike did not feel like a man who was failing. He felt like a man being torn in half by forces he was just starting to recognize. His father's world was cold and logical, with clear rules and brutal consequences. It had always been his only reality. But the warmth of Mary's little cafe, the feeling of his son in his arms, the honesty of one kiss under a street lamp, had created a new center of gravity in his life. He was caught between two suns, and he knew he had to choose one before he was pulled apart. Back in New York, the massive weight of the empire crushed him immediately. The city itself seemed to work against him, its huge buildings casting long, cold shadows that felt like his father's hands. His days were filled with meetings in dark, wood-paneled rooms and the back of expensive restaurants where the food had no taste. He was surrounded by his top men, hard men who were loyal because of fear, money, and a little bit of respect. They gave him reports about their operations, about their enemies, about the endless politics of their world. Mike handled it all with his usual skill. His mind was a sharp weapon doing its job. He made the choices that protected their land and made them more money. He was playing the role of the future king, the cold, smart leader. But it felt different now. It felt like he was wearing a costume that was too tight, that was choking him. He saw his father often. He was called to the enormous, rich mansion the family used as its base. During their meetings, Elijah watched him with the quiet stillness of a snake, his eyes seeing everything. He never said Mary's name. He never mentioned the photograph. He did not have to. The message had been delivered perfectly. The constant watch was a leash. His father was letting him run, just to feel how far he could go before he pulled it tight. Elijah was sure of himself. He believed that his son would eventually run back to the safety and power he knew. He believed he had already won the fight. But something deep inside Mike had changed. A piece of his soul had shifted, and it would not shift back. The peace he had found with Mary was not a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a new truth. It was the standard he now used to measure his life. The power he had in New York had once made him proud. Now it felt empty, like a show for people he did not care about. The respect from his men felt like a cage they had built around him. He would see his own reflection in the dark windows of a skyscraper and see a stranger wearing an expensive suit, his face a mask of control. He remembered his own unguarded face in the picture his father sent. The softness he saw there, and the difference between then and now was a physical pain. He started doing things he had never done before. He would get up in the middle of the night to check on Jeffrey, not because he had to, but because of a strange new feeling of love. He would stand over the crib in the faint light and just watch his son sleep, amazed by the tiny hands and the peaceful expression. He began to make clumsy efforts to play with the baby, holding up toys and making silly faces. The very first time Jeffrey laughed, a clean, happy sound of pure joy, Mike felt something break open inside his chest. A warmth rushed into all the cold, empty spaces in his heart. The real change happened during an important meeting about a longtime rival, a man named Lorenzo. Lorenzo was a survivor of the old conflicts, a clever man who stayed alive for decades by knowing when to attack and when to retreat. He had recently chosen to attack. One of his ventures had interfered with a vital Nelson supply line, a daring and expensive challenge that demanded a response. The agreement among the grim-faced men around the long conference table was absolute and cruel. A statement had to be made. Lorenzo had to be removed, and his business taken over. It was a common, almost routine reaction. It was the same order Mike himself would have given just a few weeks ago without hesitation. His second-in-command, an intelligent and driven man named Dominic, presented the strategy with enthusiasm. He was a thin, ambitious man with calculating eyes and a fast mind, always wanting to show his value. He pointed to a spot on a satellite image shown on the wall. "We can corner him at his daughter's wedding next month," Dominic announced, his voice steady and businesslike. "It will be loud and public. It will show everyone that no one is safe, not even during their happiest moments. The terror it creates will be more valuable than a dozen secret killings." Mike stared at the map, then at the happy face of Lorenzo's daughter in a separate file. She was young, likely in her early 20s, her face shining with the pure joy of a future bride. He remembered Mary speaking about her own daughter, the mix of pride and worry in her voice when she talked about sending her into the world. He thought of Jeffrey sleeping in the other room, his life a story yet to be written. The cold logic of his world, the detached view of people as assets and problems, suddenly felt vile and inhuman. "No," Mike said. His voice was soft, but it held a power that silenced the entire room. Dominic glanced up, his expression shifting to confusion. "Boss, this is the ideal moment. Maximum effect, with very little danger for our men." "We will not go near him at his daughter's wedding," Mike declared, his eyes moving across the faces of his crew. He held each man's gaze until they looked down. "We will not go near his family. Ever. Find a different way, one that targets only him. Attack his money, turn his own people on him, destroy his business holdings. I do not care how much time it takes, but his family stays out of it." A low sound went through the room, a wave of shock and discomfort. This was a change from their standard tactics, a break from the merciless rules Elijah had established. It was less direct, less final. It could be seen as a sign of weakness. Mike met every single stare, his face like stone, challenging anyone to question him directly. Nobody did, but he noticed the glances they shared when they believed he was not looking. He saw that a seed of uncertainty had been planted. When he informed his father of the choice later that day, Elijah's response was exactly as he had anticipated. They stood in Elijah's enormous ornate library, a room built to communicate influence and legacy. The shelves were filled with leather books Elijah had never opened, and artifacts from societies he never tried to understand. It was all for show, a performance just like everything else in their lives. "You are allowing emotion to corrupt your thinking, Michael," Elijah said, his voice deceptively quiet. He never had to raise it. The statement is the entire purpose. The fear is the real prize. You picked a weaker strategy because you are distracted by a woman and a baby in Los Angeles. You are compromised. "I made a tactical choice," Mike replied, his voice firm, refusing to be intimidated. "A public killing at a wedding brings disorder, police involvement, and press coverage. A quiet financial collapse is neater and more manageable. It demonstrates a different, more advanced kind of power." Elijah offered a smile, a thin, hungry twisting of his lips that had no trace of warmth. "Do not insult me by pretending this is about tactics. This is about her. You are becoming weak, and our rivals will sense it like sharks smelling blood. I have dedicated my whole life to building this empire. I will not allow you to destroy it because you suddenly grew a conscience." The argument grew more intense from that point. It was a clash of two wills, the result of a lifetime of quiet anger and suffocating dominance. For the first time ever, Mike refused to surrender. He did not fall back into silent agreement. He fought back, defending his position not as a moment of weakness, but as a new path forward. "Your way is finished, father," Mike said. The words felt like both betrayal and freedom as he spoke them. "It is a cycle of violence that has no end. Every rival we make has a family, and those families raise the next generation of rivals. There are different ways to maintain power." "There is only one way," Elijah hissed. His pleasant disguise finally fell away, showing the raw, angry despot underneath. His face was a contorted mask of disgust. "The way that guarantees we survive, the way that I showed you. And you are putting it all at risk. You are risking everything we have made, everything that I have given you." Mike walked out of the library that night aware that his father was right about one thing. He was compromised. Not from weakness, but because his idea of what it meant to survive had changed. It was no longer about the business, about the Nelson legacy and its violent history. It was about Jeffrey. It was about Mary. It was about a possible life where he did not have to become his father to feel strong. Over the next 2 weeks, a plan took shape in the shadows. It was the most intricate and perilous strategy he had ever devised, executed with the cold precision his father had beaten into him. The bitter irony was not lost on him. This was not about seizing new territory or crushing a competitor. This was about breaking free. He was turning every skill his father had given him, every ounce of ruthless planning, against the very empire he was meant to rule. He was meticulously taking his own cage apart, piece by piece. He started by silently funneling his private wealth into untraceable offshore accounts. He forged new identities, burying them under layers of shell companies so dense they would be a nightmare to unravel. He established a completely legitimate logistics company through proxies his father's network could never connect to him. He toiled deep into the night, long after everyone else had gone. His associates were asleep while he scrubbed his digital footprint with the precision of a man planning a perfect crime. The most daunting challenge was guaranteeing a future for Mary and Jeffrey. He could not just vanish into thin air. His father would view such an act as the ultimate betrayal, an insult so personal it could never be forgiven. Elijah's vengeance would be a relentless force. He would hunt them across the globe, not from a sense of lost love, but from a burning need to prove that nothing ever escaped his grasp. This reality forced Mike to create one last, desperate gambit. He understood his father's deepest vulnerability was an obsession with his own legacy. The empire had to stand powerful and unbroken. Mike also knew that Dominic, his ambitious second, had been making his own plays, quietly gathering influence and building his own base of loyal men. He was almost certainly positioning himself for the day Mike stumbled, ready to fill the power vacuum. The man Mike used to be would have seen this as a threat that needed to be neutralized. The man Mike had become saw a path to freedom. He set up a secret meeting with Dominic at a small, forgettable diner in a part of the city where they were both strangers. The location was so public and so neutral that it offered them both a fragile sense of safety. "You want my chair, do not you?" Mike asked, cutting straight to the chase as Dominic settled into the booth opposite him. "You think I have gone soft. You think you could run things better." Dominic's eyes narrowed, his body rigid with suspicion. He was clearly trying to figure out if this was an elaborate trap. "I am loyal to the family, boss. I always have been." "Loyalty is just another form of payment," Mike replied, his father's old words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And you are angling for a raise. I get it. Ambition is not a sin. I am going to give you exactly what you desire. The family, the entire organization, it is all yours. But there is one condition." The surprise on Dominic's face was real, shattering his hardened mask. He had been bracing for a war, not receiving a crown. "What is the condition?" "You will make certain my father thinks this entire thing was his own idea," Mike laid out, leaning in. "You are going to go to him. You will give him proof that I am weak, that I am distracted. You will lay out the financial statements from the legitimate business I am building and present it as evidence of my divided attention. You will persuade him that I am a lost cause, a weak link that must be severed for the family's survival. You will then propose that the only way to preserve the empire is to name a stronger, more dedicated leader. You. You will make him believe he is choosing you to rescue his legacy from his own failed son." Mike let the idea settle. It was a brilliant piece of manipulation, feeding both Dominic's hunger for power and Elijah's massive ego. It gave his father a way to come out on top, exiling his disappointing son while keeping his empire intact. It would be under a new leader he had supposedly chosen himself. "And what do I get in return?" Dominic asked, his mind visibly calculating the odds, weighing every risk against the ultimate prize. "In return," Mike answered, his voice devoid of all warmth, "you will make me a ghost. My son and the woman I am with, Mary, are to be declared completely untouchable. Any move made against them by my father or by anyone else will be treated as a direct assault on your new leadership. You will back this up with the full force of the family's influence. That is the price of the throne. You take the power, I take my freedom. And if that freedom is ever disturbed, I will burn your new empire to ash. You and I both know I can do it." Dominic did know. He had witnessed Mike's ruthlessness up close. He understood exactly what the man could do when cornered. He gave a slow nod, a new kind of respect dawning in his eyes. The deal was sealed over 2 cups of cold coffee in a nameless diner. The final confrontation with his father felt like a hollow anticlimax. Dominic had performed his role flawlessly, delivering his report with the perfect blend of feigned reluctance and naked ambition. Elijah called Mike to the library for the last time. The old man was seated behind his enormous desk with a folder lying open before him. He did not seem angry. He just seemed weary and deeply disappointed. A weapon Mike knew was far more dangerous in his father's hands. "Dominic has brought some things to my attention," Elijah said, gesturing toward the folder. "This new life you are building, these clean businesses, your sad, ongoing fixation on that woman and her little coffee shop. I had hoped you would come to your senses. It is clear to me now that I was mistaken. You lack the spine for what this family requires. You are not the man I made you." Mike stood in silence before the desk, allowing his father to deliver the final lines in their long, bitter play. "You are making a terrible mistake, Mike," Elijah stated, his tone dripping with cold finality. "Do you really believe you can just walk away from all of this? From me? From what we are? You have no idea what you are doing." Mike did not even blink. "I have lived my entire life doing what you demanded, Father. That ends today. I am finished with all of it." Elijah rose to his feet, his face a mask of cold calculation. "You are weak, Mike. You have always been weak. It is your mother's blood in you. I always suspected it. You think you can escape this life, this legacy. You cannot. It is part of you. You will come crawling back here the moment that woman is done with you, the moment the real world chews you up and spits you out. You will come crawling back, and I will not be here to open the door." Mike simply shook his head, the sting of his father's words gone. They were just noise, echoes from a life he was already leaving behind. "I am not coming back. I have made my choice. I will not look back." For a long moment, only a thick, suffocating silence filled the space between them. The tension in the room was a physical presence. Then Elijah's voice cut through the quiet, colder than ice. "You are no longer my son," he hissed, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure contempt. "You are nothing to me. A failure. A complete disappointment. I do not have a son." Mike's heart did not break. He had been hearing variations of those words for his entire life. They were once a weapon, a tool used to control him. But today, they had no power. They were just the last pathetic shots from a man who had already lost. He was finally free. "Goodbye, Father," Mike said. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, out of the library, and out of the life that had been built to imprison him. He never looked back. He was on a flight to Los Angeles that very same day, holding Jeffrey in his arms. The city looked different as the plane made its descent. It was no longer a map of business interests and rival territories. It looked like a new beginning. He did not check into a hotel. He went directly to Mary's cafe. He saw her sitting on a bench out front, her head tilted toward the setting sun. The warm, golden light washed over the quiet street. She seemed at peace, completely absorbed in her thoughts. Her head snapped up as he got closer, her eyes growing wide with surprise before they softened at the sight of his face. He was not the same man who had left her with a weak excuse and a haunted expression. He looked lighter. He looked free. "Mike," she breathed, getting to her feet as he stopped in front of her. "What is happening?" He gently took her hands in his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a terrifying new sense of hope. "I left it all," he said, his voice strong and certain. "The business, my father, every last part of it. I am never going back. I came here for you, for Jeffrey, for us." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes, shimmering in the fading light. She scanned his face, searching for a lie, for a hidden catch. She found nothing but the truth. She threw her arms around him, pulling him into an embrace. She held on as if she might never let him go. "You really mean it," she whispered against his shoulder. "I mean it," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I choose this life. With you. With our son. If you still want me." She pulled away just enough to frame his face with her hands, her gaze locking with his. "I want you, Mike. All of you." For the first time he could remember, he felt he was in exactly the right place in the world. He had turned his back on the darkness and was finally ready to face the light. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he was not afraid to find out. The months that came after were a time of slow, quiet healing. It was not a perfect story. There was no magical fix. Ghosts of his former life still lingered, creating moments of sudden paranoia. He would check the door locks 3 times, scan every face in a crowd, or wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing from a nightmare. The old ways of thinking were difficult to overcome, but day by day, his former life lost some of its hold on him. He dedicated his focus and his vast resources to his new, legitimate enterprise. The logistics firm presented a true challenge, a world of agreements, rules, and client needs that was completely different from the harsh simplicity of his past. But it was a clean endeavor. Each achievement was his own, free from the stain of violence and fear. He discovered an unexpected fulfillment in creating something instead of just taking it. He, Mary, and Jeffrey settled in a plain house with a small yard, a simple home with a porch that creaked and a large tree out front. It was nothing like the cold, enormous mansions where he was raised. This house was full of warmth, with the smell of Mary's baking, and soon, the sound of Jeffrey saying his first words. The baby's first word, to Mike's private joy, was Dada. One peaceful afternoon, Mike sat on the living room floor trying to construct a tower from bright blocks with Jeffrey. The baby, who was now a strong toddler, had a different idea. His greatest pleasure was in the act of demolition. No, no, look, you put them on top of each other, Mike said, gently setting one block over another. Like this, see? A tower. Jeffrey observed with deep focus, his small forehead wrinkled. The instant the third block was in place, he lunged with a happy yell and knocked the tower to pieces. He has sharp instincts, Mary commented from the doorway, her voice full of laughter. He knows that tearing down is quicker than building up. He is a natural, Mike replied, collecting the blocks for another go. Maybe a little too natural. Mary came and sat with them, and Jeffrey instantly climbed onto her lap, the blocks now forgotten. Mike looked at them, the woman and his son, a scene of pure, simple happiness. He felt a rush of feeling that still caught him off guard with its power. One night they sat together on their little porch, watching the first fireflies flicker in the fading light. Mike drew a long breath. A deep sense of peace had settled inside him, a silence in his soul he had never experienced before. I never knew this was real, he said in a low voice, his arm resting around Mary. This quietness, this feeling. My entire life, I thought peace was for other people. I thought it was for the weak. I was completely wrong. Mary looked up at him and leaned her head on his chest. It was always inside you, Mike. You just needed time to finally see it. You had to decide to look. He gave a small smile as the last bit of tension he had held for a lifetime seemed to melt away. I have no idea where I would be if I had not met you, he admitted. You will never need to know, she answered, giving his hand a squeeze. We face this together, always. But the past was not something you could simply bury. It sent one last messenger to their door. A sudden sharp knock on a quiet afternoon destroyed their peaceful rhythm. Mike recognized the sound immediately. It was firm, precise, and carried a cold sense of authority. His entire body went stiff as old survival instincts flared to life. He saw the color drain from Mary's face. He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw a man in a dark coat standing on his porch. The face was familiar. It was Frank, a man who had served as one of his most trusted enforcers for almost a decade. Mike opened the door, using his body to shield the inside of the house from view. Frank, he said, his voice perfectly steady. You should not have come here. Frank did not react, his gaze cold and professional as it met Mike's. Dominic sent me. He said you should have this. He held out a thick envelope. And he has a message. Mike made no move to take it. What is the message? The old man is gone. He passed away in his sleep last week. His heart finally gave out. Frank's voice was completely empty of emotion. Dominic wanted you to know. He also wanted you to know that your deal is being honored. You and your family are completely off the record. This envelope has the last of the paperwork. It is the legal title to a few properties the old man held in your name. Dominic figured you should have them, a totally clean break. Mike processed the news of his father's death. He waited to feel something, maybe grief, or even just a small sense of loss. But the only thing he felt was a quiet, final ending, like closing a book he had finished a long time ago. The man who had ruled his life, who had twisted and broken him, was dead, and Mike only felt peace. He finally took the envelope. Thank Dominic for me, and tell him the agreement goes both ways. As long as my family is left alone, he will have no trouble from me. Frank gave a slight nod. His eyes flickered past Mike for just a second, taking in the simple house and the children's toys left on the porch. A brief expression, maybe curiosity, crossed his face. Then he turned around and walked away. Mike shut the door and turned the lock. He saw Mary standing in the center of the room, her arms crossed tightly around herself. Who was that man? she asked, her voice shaking just a little. He went to her and pulled her into a hug. A ghost, he told her, here to say goodbye. He did not mention that his father had died. That was a wound he needed to deal with on his own time, in his own way. For now, he just held her tight. As days became weeks, and weeks turned into months, the ghosts of his past faded into simple memory. Mike and Mary built their future together, one piece at a time, one day at a time. Their life was made of small happiness. It was trips to the local park, showing Jeffrey how to throw a baseball. It was the smell of Mary's baking that filled their kitchen on Sunday mornings. It was quiet talks on the porch while the sun set. It was completely ordinary, and it meant everything. One afternoon, Mary was helping Jeffrey take his very first unsteady steps on his own across the living room carpet. Mike sat on the sofa, his heart pounding, as he watched his son wobble toward him with a look of intense focus. "Come on, my boy," he said, holding his arms out. "You can do it. Come to Dada." Jeffrey managed one step, and then another. His small legs were shaky, but he was determined. He swayed and almost fell, but then he caught his balance with a look of pure triumph. He took 3 more steps before he fell into Mike's arms, laughing with joy. Mike held his son close, taking in the smell of baby shampoo and innocence. He looked over at Mary, who was watching them with happy tears running down her cheeks. In that moment, something became perfectly clear. Redemption did not come from conquering other people. It came from conquering your own demons. You found it by choosing love instead of power, by choosing to be vulnerable instead of being in control. It was in the small, quiet moments of an honest life. He was not Mike Nelson, the mob boss, anymore. That man was gone, buried with his father and the cold world they created. He was just Mike, a father, a partner, a man who gave up everything to find something that was real. He looked at Mary, saw the light in her eyes, and felt a peace that was so deep and total. It felt like finally coming home after a very long trip. He was free. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. 5 years had gone by since Mike Nelson left his old life behind. 5 years of quiet sunrises and peaceful nights. 5 years filled with scraped knees and birthday cakes, with small fights about bedtime and debates about eating vegetables. It was 5 years of a life he never thought was possible for someone like him. The house they lived in was bigger than the first small place they had rented. But it was not extravagant. It was a comfortable home for their family, on a street with big trees in a quiet part of town, the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other and kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on. Mike had bought it outright with money from his logistics company, which was now doing very well. The money was clean, earned from hard work. He felt a quiet, powerful pride in that fact every single day. On this specific Saturday morning, the house was alive with the sound of happy chaos. Jeffrey, now a busy 6-year-old with his father's dark eyes and his mother's kind heart, was running through the living room with a toy airplane, making loud buzzing sounds. His younger sister, Elena, named as a quiet tribute to the woman who had died for his son, followed him on shaky legs. She was 2 years old, with a head of soft brown curls and a laugh that could warm anyone's heart. Mike often wondered what his old crew would think if they saw him now, chasing a giggling toddler with a little cup in his hand. They would never recognize him. Sometimes he barely recognized himself, and he was deeply thankful for that. Mary was in the kitchen getting ready for the small get-together they were having that afternoon. Her daughter, Lily, was coming to visit from the East Coast. She now had a job as an assistant curator in a small art museum. It was the first time their whole family would be in one place for months, and Mary had been planning the food for weeks. Mike stood in the kitchen doorway, just watching her move around so easily, humming a little song to herself. She noticed him looking at her and lifted an eyebrow. "Are you planning to help me, or are you just going to stay there and look at me?" she asked, a playful smile on her face. "I was leaning toward looking," he answered, walking over to put his arms around her waist from behind. but I am also happy to help. What can I do? She leaned into his arms for a second, letting out a small, happy sigh. I need you to make sure the kids do not wreck the house before Lily arrives. And maybe you can set the table. I can handle that, he said. He gave her a soft kiss on her temple and then let her go. He found Jeffrey and Elena out in the backyard. Jeffrey was trying to teach his little sister about how airplanes work. She was much more focused on trying to eat a dandelion. Elena, no, we do not eat those, Mike said, carefully taking the flower out of her tiny, strong hand. She gazed up at him with big, innocent eyes, and his heart tightened with a love so strong it still took him by surprise after all this time. He lifted her into his arms, and she immediately reached out and grabbed his nose, giggling. Dad, when is Lily getting here? Jeffrey asked. He dropped his plane and ran over to them. She said she was going to bring me a book about dinosaurs. She will be here very soon, Mike told him, running his free hand through his son's hair. How about you help me set the table? You can be in charge of putting out the napkins. Jeffrey thought about this with the intense focus of a general making a battle plan. Can I fold them into shapes? Lily taught me how to make a swan the last time she was here. You can certainly try, Mike said, a smile forming on his face. The afternoon passed with the comfortable warmth of a family gathering. Lily showed up with presents for the children and a bottle of wine for the adults. She had grown into a calm, smart young woman who had her mother's strength and spirit. Mike had been nervous when he first met her all those years ago. He was very aware that he was the new person in their family. But Lily had accepted him with a careful kindness that had slowly turned into real affection. She always called him Mike, never Dad, and he did not expect her to. The relationship they had was good enough. It was genuine. They all sat down to eat at the long. A terrible injustice was done to Mike, leaving him a powerless man trapped in a life that was not his own. But he learned a crucial lesson. True power is what protects the ones you love. You need to hear this story to understand. Inside the house, the noise of family life seemed normal. Lily discussed her art gallery, and Mary told stories about her cafe. The children, Jeffrey and Elena, were loud and happy. But as the sun went down, Mike stood alone on the porch. He felt the warmth of his coffee cup, a small anchor in a sea of memory. The happy sounds from inside were a shield. They were the beautiful, ordinary music he had fought to hear. Mary joined him, her hand finding his in the growing darkness. What are you thinking about? She asked quietly. He thought about the man he was forced to be. A cold, empty tool for his father, moving through a world of silent orders and hidden threats. He remembered the fear, the constant exhaustion, and the profound loneliness of that life. He recalled the choices that led him here, the world he had to burn down just to build this one. I was just thinking about how I got here, he finally said. None of this feels real. I live with it every day, but I am so grateful. Mary tightened her grip on his hand. This was not a gift, Mike. You earned this. That was not luck. That was you being brave. He looked at the woman who saw past the monster on a plane and believed in the man nobody else could see. He leaned in to kiss her, a slow and gentle kiss that said everything he could not. Then a voice from inside shattered the moment. Dad. Elena has spaghetti in her hair again. A small smile touched Mike's lips. My turn. Mary's laugh was a bright, clear sound in the cool night air. Go on. I am right here. He walked back into the light of his home. He was walking toward his children, toward the life he chose. He was no longer an instrument of a corrupt system. He was just Mike, a father, a husband, and as he lifted his laughing, pasta-covered daughter into his arms, he knew he had won. He was finally, completely home. You see, true power is not about control. It is about protection. Silence allows terrible things to happen, and sometimes justice is simply choosing to build a life where the darkness cannot reach you.